Final Fantasy is one of the most polarizing franchises in all of gaming, and it's for a very simple reason. The series has undergone massive changes over the course of its long tenure in the industry, and those changes are either received favorably by people who prefer the newer, real-time action style, or unfavorably by those who prefer the era of the turn-based and ATB turn-based era of Final Fantasy. And with each new release in the franchise, this debate inevitably resurfaces, and I've covered it quite extensively on the channel in the past. Link in the description. But today, let's ask a straightforward question and dig into it, shall we? Was modern Final Fantasy a mistake? So first off, let's define modern Final Fantasy, and this will vary upon the individual. The definition I will work off of is post-Final Fantasy XII. I haven't played the 13 games myself, so I won't talk about them, but the games I'll talk about for modern Final Fantasy will be 14, 15, and 7 Remake, and what we have seen so far of Final Fantasy XVI. You could break up the games before this point into multiple different subcategories of their own, but let's use FF1 to 12 as our definition of Legacy Final Fantasy. And if you're wondering why I'm not putting FF12 in modern Final Fantasies, it came out in 2006. Yeah, feel old yet? Actually, let's talk about that, because I think speed of releases does play a bit of a factor in this discussion. Final Fantasy games used to release at a far faster clip than they do nowadays. FF6 was in 1994, 3 years later was FF7 in 97. Okay, so roughly on par with today, with there being roughly a 2 to 3 year gap in Final Fantasy releases. Then 2 years later was 8 in 99. Then just a year later in 2000 was FF9 and FF10 releasing so quickly in 2001, this time for the PS2. FF11 was the first MMO Final Fantasy would produce and would come out in 2002. And then we have that pause until 2006 for Final Fantasy XII. I'm talking mainline releases, numbered games here by the way. Then 3 years later we got 13 and that series started to come out. And there was a solid period of time there where you got essentially yearly releases of Final Fantasy games, and each of those games is somebody's favorite. Sure, people view 8 in a polarizing lens due to the junction mechanic, but since that pace of game releases are on average of such high quality, that's a pretty high bar to set, and that pace wouldn't eventually hold. We had Final Fantasy 15 in 2016, then 7 Remake in 2020, and now in 2023 we are getting Final Fantasy 16. And somewhere in between we got Final Fantasy Origins, but nobody talks about that game anymore. I won't forget you, Jack. But that doesn't necessarily paint a complete picture either, because we also have Final Fantasy 14. Now 14 is the MMO nowadays. Sure, 11 exists, but 14's the heavy hitter. And not everybody plays it, but it is extremely popular, and is a numbered Final Fantasy game, whether you like it or not. And in my opinion, it contains the best story in all of the series. It gets updates rather consistently every 4 months that contain chunks of what is known as MSQ, or main story quests, that further the overarching narratives with pieces of side content that tell stories of their own and further their own narratives. But every other year the game gets an expansion, containing a narrative roughly on par, if not flat out surpassing, the amount of content a traditional FF game would contain. And when you factor in those releases on top of the release schedule for the single-player games, the timelines don't seem as stretched out as they may appear at first glance. Now let's talk about the quality of the games, which is arguably the most important aspect here. Obviously, the reign of FF1 to 12 is hard to topple. Like I said before, those games are of such high consistent quality once you at least get to Final Fantasy III, from what I hear, that you can normally find a good number of people that love whatever title you pull out of a hat. I've seen a playthrough of Final Fantasy IV, and I've played 6, 7, a good chunk of 8, a little bit of 9, I played Final Fantasy X myself, and I've played Final Fantasy XII. I've played Final Fantasy 14, 16, and, not 16, 15, and 7 Remake. And 7 is the one that gets the most shine to it, the most attention, and that will rub some people the wrong way. Like every time I do a poll on my channel that contains anything involving 7, the 7 category or character crushes the poll, absolutely dominates it. You go to the comments, it's all people hating on 7. It's hilarious to see sometimes. But there's a reason many people will say that your favorite Final Fantasy will be the first one you play. It serves as your introduction into the series and tells you what it's all about, and really sets the scene, and the memories of playing your first Final Fantasy game are hard to beat. and 7 was many people's first Final Fantasy. It wasn't mine, but I still hold 7 in high regard, and is one of my favorites. And you know what? Speaking of first Final Fantasy games, let's transition over to my first Final Fantasy game. And no, I don't count the 15 minutes of 14 that I played on a trial account back when it first dropped in Heavensward. My first Final Fantasy game that I really sunk my teeth into, played and enjoyed, was Final Fantasy 15, the last numbered game to release. And yeah, 15 is heavily controversial, and for good reason. There's many aspects to it that quite frankly suck, are rushed and or underdeveloped. The plot is rudimentary at best. Many parts of the open world feel rather devoid of interesting activities to accomplish. Many characters don't get the care they need either. And for a series largely popularized on its narrative and engrossing cast of characters, floundering in the story department does not bode well for the success of a Final Fantasy game. Despite all that, I would still rate 15 highly, and probably in my top 3 Final Fantasy games. Like, it would probably go 14, then 7, then maybe 15. Now, why is that? I just laid out those titanic flaws the game suffers from, and that's not even to mention the combat, feeling unsatisfyingly clunky. And it honestly feels like a very rough prototype of the real-time action the series would develop in its next few titles. Well, remember what I said? It's likely that your favorite Final Fantasy game will be the first one you play. And yeah, 15 has all those flaws, but to me, it's a game of peaks and valleys, because god dang it do I love the main characters of 15. Those 4 boys hard carry and just on their shoulders carry the emotional investment or reaction that I had with the game as a whole, because they're just so lovable and work off each other to such an effective degree that if you treat the game as a glorified road trip with the boys, going through randomly generated shonen experiences, then honestly, it's a very enjoyable time. If there's one thing they nailed with 15 more than anything else, it's those 4 boys. They carry the scenes that are supposed to be emotional because I at least cared for them and their reactions to what's going on. So while the overall plot was rushed and underdeveloped and lacking in critical expansion or elaboration, or even emotional depth, I still cared about it to some degree because of the way it affected the 4. How they genuinely cared for each other, argued at falling outs, or propped each other up and made up with each other. The villain again suffers from the plot being subpar, but his personality and general air to himself helps carry him to be an effective villain. 15 has its strong suits, it's just wildly unpolished, and the game will always leave a perpetual legacy of what if. What if the game had more time, was properly paced and fleshed out, and will always leave a bit of a sour taste in your mouth because of that. But it wasn't fleshed out, it wasn't properly paced, and we got what we got. And certain characters like 13, and certain, not characters, chapters like 13, was so bad, they had to be redesigned post-launch to be even kind of tolerable. It sucks. It really, really sucks, because the game has so much potential and could have been widely regarded as a modern masterpiece. If a game is just flat out bad, or I had no expectations for it, fine, I don't particularly care about it. I can move on. When a game has this much potential though, it still stinks. Because you can see it, you can see the finish line of what could be, but it just wasn't meant to be. But the game will always still hold a special place for me. It got me into the series proper and is one of my favorite endings of any game I've ever seen or played, and for a story whose largest weakness was the plot, that should tell you how special that ending is in my opinion. Sure, we didn't get the DLC novel ending. I kind of just content with the one we got. I view it in high regard. And then we have the 7 Remake, and this is one of those games where I just flat out never understand the points that people make against this game. I love it so much. Unabashedly so. Combat, story, characters, setting, everything. I love almost everything in this game, except maybe the level design, and I think the combat can get a little bit too spammy on certain enemies. And I think enemy design just kind of flounders near the end of the game. Yeah, I get it. They were trying to emulate the linearity of Midgar from Final Fantasy VII, but playing an entire game of just corridors gets pretty old. Look, I've made a video before in defense of modern Final Fantasy, and that's not what this video's about. Because to me, 15 is the most flawed game of what I would classify as modern Final Fantasy. And to me, it still has a lot of good aspects to it that I value. I'm glad Final Fantasy 15 exists, even in this unpolished state. And whether or not you view modern Final Fantasy as a mistake will depend largely on your preferences. But these stories that are being told, in my opinion, suit this new style of game. And to me, the gameplay accompanying them is getting better and better. 14 is an MMO and has a distinct gameplay style to it, with its hotkey-based action system, so I'll omit it from this discussion. But we start at 15, and as we go from here, we can see what they prioritize, and what they iterate on as we go from game to game leading to Final Fantasy XVI. With 15, the combat is oriented on a few key principles: swapping weapons to vary up the flow, using warp strikes to close distance and get to safety, and the main one, the meat and potatoes of the combat: combos. Combos work not off of button presses, but off of the direction you hold the stick while holding down the attack button. It's definitely unique, but to me is a failed experiment. It feels mechanically unsatisfying to just hold a button down and move the stick in a different direction for different combos. It can get glossed over in a lot of conversations about games, but the act of actually pressing a button can feel mechanically satisfying. Holding it down can just feel floaty and unimpactful. You move over to Final Fantasy VII Remake, and the combat takes a significant detour from Final Fantasy XV in that regard. Gone are the days of holding down the attack button, and instead they decide to reincorporate a more traditional magic system in lieu of the consumable style of Final Fantasy XV, and return the button presses for each action. And if you hold the button down, then you can do a little bit of AoE, but you're not just holding it down the entire time. Combat is a bit of a hybridization of turn-based, with the ATB system being utilized for actions and spells and consumables, with a rather spammy, straightforward, real-time action system being at the center of it all. 7 Remake has its detractors, but most fans of the game, from my experience, praise this combat system, myself included. It can lead to some really fun fights and just overall satisfying gameplay. Sure, can it be better? Yeah, absolutely. Do I think it's a massive step in the right direction compared to 15? Again, yes, absolutely. And as we look ahead to 16, what are they doing? They're leaning far more into those button presses for actions, largely sidestepping more toward the Devil May Cry style of combo-oriented gameplay, where you are weaving in various forms, with various attacks. Remember the different weapons you had in 15 and different characters you could play as in Final Fantasy VII Remake? And how they gave you different styles of combat on a moment's notice and at your disposal? Do you see how that's kind of being influenced here with the various iconic forms that you can use in 16 for the combos, and customize and flesh out? The revisions in the formula from one game to the next are steep, but you can see certain threads carrying over as to what direction they want to pivot the gameplay towards with each of these titles. They are experimenting, and while I think the combat of 15 and 7 Remake both have their flaws, I think overall they can produce enjoyable moments, especially 7 Remake. And the only thing I really wanted out of 7 Remake was some combos to make standard melee attacks more interesting and not just button spamming, which seems to be the direction they are taking 16. So personally, I wouldn't view the modern era of Final Fantasy as a mistake, but we are seeing large amounts of experimentation and revision when it comes to the gameplay formula. I think story-wise, they are wanting to tell stories that are far more character-oriented and slower paced than the Final Fantasy games of old. Those games are always character-driven, but it's the type of character-driven story that is starting to see some changes. As with more modern engines and styles of games, more cinematic experiences can be delivered, stopping to smell the roses. Certain scenes can be more drawn out as they're able to utilize the better tech to create visuals and experiences that are really immersive. I would argue 15 tried to have a narrative with the pacing of a traditional Final Fantasy game, and it just doesn't work, because the style of game that 15 is just doesn't work with the type of pacing that made those older Final Fantasy games so iconic and recognized. You are trying to put a square peg into a triangular hole. It's not the fault of either the hole or the peg, it's just the wrong matchup. And when it comes to 7 Remake, they slowed things down dramatically. Heck, directly compare 7 Remake to old 7. Midgar was a fine section for Final Fantasy VII, because its pacing was pretty fast, and focused largely on the important players to drive the point home and act as a prologue for the rest of the game. It didn't need or want to focus on characters like Jesse, Biggs, Wedge, Johnny. It didn't need to flesh out that cast of characters, because it understood, hey, for the pacing we're going at, we need to hone in on these characters specifically. Barrett, Tifa, Aerith, Cloud, Rufus, stuff like that. And they focused on those characters with a faster pace to keep you engaged, because they don't have a lot to work with when it comes from a storytelling department. With 7 Remake, that style of experience is far more conducive to slowing things down, fleshing out side characters in certain locations, and not trying to go plot point to plot point. Let the voice acting and animations, facial expressions, let those things hold their own and tell a story all to themselves. That is the advantage of modern Final Fantasy, in my opinion, is that they have these new storytelling techniques available to them to utilize to tell stories that just wouldn't fit in the older style. And I'm not talking about turn-based there when I'm talking about older style. I'm talking about the older style of storytelling for Final Fantasy. And I've made it clear, I think there's room for iteration on both eras of Final Fantasy. I love both as well, and I'm not the type of guy to just come out here and say one is objectively better than the other, because I don't even believe that. They have their own style and flavor, and when taken as a complete package, I think each of these modern Final Fantasies have value to them. I haven't talked much about 14 here, because if I did, I would be here forever, and I already talked ad nauseam as to why I think 14 has the best story in the franchise, and arguably in all of gaming in my opinion. And I also love the gameplay on top of that, and we can't really argue as to the quality of 16, since we haven't played it yet, but it's looking like it's iterating again on the lessons from 15 and 7 Remake, and I'm very optimistic as to the state of the game. And the story seems to be shaping up relatively well. And at the end of the day, we all have our own preferences, and real-time or turn-based or even ATB turn-based gameplay won't be for everyone, nor do I think they have to be. Had they just made strictly turn-based experiences instead of these modern Final Fantasy games, or even replaced the combat for these games with turn-based gameplay, we don't know how they would sell, or have sold. I'm not of the sect of people that say turn-based games are dying, or don't do well in the modern era either, and I feel like a lot of those arguments people try and pose in support of that notion are just massively coping when examples are brought up to counter that idea. But at the end of the day, I think it is undeniable that Final Fantasy is trying to find a new identity, and has seen some growing pains associated with that. You can identify that the series has some growing pains or has some flaws to it, but still really enjoy it. Two things can't be true at the same time. Not everything has been a home run like yesteryear, and there are hiccups and huge issues with some of these games, but I think 7 Remake cleaned up a lot of the issues that 15 had, and we need to wait and see for 16. But I would push back on the notion that modern Final Fantasy games are a mistake. Flawed? Yes. Improving? Also yes. Settling into the new style? Yes. A mistake? I would not classify them as so. Some people will take a preference towards a series just never changing its style or gameplay, including from a gameplay department. I think that's an understandable position to hold. People like a certain style of game, and when their favorite series changes fundamentally away from what they loved and cherished for so long, they can feel left in the dust. Sure, you can throw other new series akin to the old at them, like Bravely Default, or even Octopath 2, but they will still crave for that unique style those original games uniquely offered to them. It's a style not for everyone, but for them it was exactly what they wanted, and a complete fundamental change away from that to a wholly different genre will be off-putting, and understandably so. And the degree with which this affects you will vary depending upon what your answer to the next question is. What is Final Fantasy to you? If you answer turn-based RPG, then you probably won't like the new style. And if you answer with something more akin to story or lore or characters or music, then the new style is a bit of a departure, sure, but you can still probably feel some essence of Final Fantasy to it. So the identity hasn't changed wholesale, but has transformed itself with a bit of a makeover. It's polarizing, and I understand that. It always is when a series pivots away from what it was established to be for so many years, and across so many entries. And yeah, Final Fantasy has played around with different genres, but largely relegated those to spin-offs and non-numbered games. So, is modern Final Fantasy a mistake? It depends on what you identify as a mistake. Personally, I don't mind the direction change, and while the series has experienced some growing pains, I think the trajectory is heading in a solid direction for the future, and overall I'm optimistic. And I'm glad that these games exist. So, I'm going to call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in, my pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games out there if you can, and as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye everybody until we meet again.